The fog was rolling in off the Atlantic the morning I realized I had nothing left to sell. I stood at the kitchen window of my little house in Dartmouth, watching the harbor disappear behind gray nothing, and I did the math again in my head. The way I'd been doing it every morning for 4 months, hoping somehow the numbers would change. My pension from 31 years of teaching was $2,200 a month. I had $22,000 left in my RRSP. I'd already cashed out everything else after my husband passed 3 years ago. And my grandson needed $285,000 for a treatment that Nova Scotia Health Authority wouldn't cover, not because it wasn't real, not because it wouldn't work, but because it was still classified as experimental for his specific condition, a rare mitochondrial disorder that was slowly taking the function from his muscles and would take his life before he turned 20. He was 16. I turned away from the window and went to get dressed for my shift at the pharmacy. I'd gone back to work as a dispensary assistant 18 months ago when the bills started. My knees ached every evening. I didn't complain about that to anyone. It was a Thursday in late October when Pauline, who owned the pharmacy and had known me since my teaching days, stopped me near the back counter and held out an envelope. "This came for you," she said, with a look I couldn't quite read. "Hand-delivered this morning." Before we opened, my name was on the front in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. Dorothy Mackinnon, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of cream stationery, the kind you had to special order. "Mrs. Dorothy Mackinnon, I have become aware of your family's current situation, and I believe I may be in a position to offer you a resolution. I am not in the habit of correspondence, but this is a matter of some urgency for us both. If you are willing to hear a business proposition, please come to Ashford House, 14 Osprey Point Road, Chester, on Saturday at 11 o'clock in the morning. Come alone. I assure you this is a legitimate matter. Edward Hartley." Pauline was reading over my shoulder. "Ashford House," she said quietly. "Dorothy, that's the old Hartley estate." I knew the name the way everyone along that stretch of the South Shore knew it. The Hartleys had built their money in commercial real estate and structural engineering over 3 generations. The family had been a fixture in Halifax society once. But Edward Hartley, the last one, the one who'd stayed, had shut himself away inside that property on the Chester Peninsula for the better part of 20 years. Nobody saw him. Nobody knew exactly why. The stories people told were the usual kind. He was ill, he was eccentric, he was hiding something worse than either. What I knew was that the envelope smelled faintly of cedar, and that I had $22,000 standing between my grandson and the rest of his life. I drove out to Chester on Saturday morning. Ashford House sat at the end of a gravel road through spruce trees, a 3-story stone and clapboard house with a wraparound veranda facing the ocean. It was imposing and lovely and looked like it hadn't changed since 1955. A woman about my age answered the door before I'd finished knocking. "Mrs. Mackinnon." "I'm Ruth. Mr. Hartley's housekeeper. Please come in." The inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old books. There were framed architectural drawings on the walls, bridges, buildings, cross-sections of structures I didn't recognize. Beautiful things. Ruth led me through to a sitting room with a fire going and told me he'd be right in. He came through the door a few minutes later, and I understood immediately that whatever I'd been expecting, it wasn't this. He was tall and still straight-backed at what I guessed was 73 or 74, with white hair gone silver at the temples and careful gray eyes that assessed me the way I used to assess a classroom at the start of the year. He wore a charcoal wool sweater and, despite being inside his own warm home, a pair of thin gray leather gloves. He didn't extend his hand. "Mrs. Mackinnon, thank you for coming." He gestured to the chair across from his own. "I'll be direct. I don't enjoy wasting time." "Neither do I," I said. The corners of his mouth moved very slightly. He sat down, gloves folded in his lap. "Your grandson, Daniel. He has Murph syndrome. The Emory Clinic in Minneapolis is the only facility currently offering the mitochondrial gene therapy trial that shows meaningful efficacy for his genotype. The cost for the full protocol is $285,000 Canadian dollars, none of which is covered by provincial or federal health plans. Your family has raised approximately $11,000 through a fundraising page. Your daughter is working 2 positions and cannot take on additional debt. You have liquidated the majority of your assets. You are running out of options and time." I stared at him. How do you know all of that? I have access to information when I need it. That's not the point. He met my eyes steadily. I'm prepared to pay for Daniel's treatment in full, in addition to a monthly stipend of $8,000 and a lump sum of $40,000 at the end of 12 months. In exchange, I need a wife. The fire cracked behind him. I didn't move. A legal marriage, he continued, as if he were describing terms on a lease. 1 year, you would live here at Ashford House, accompany me to a small number of social and legal obligations, and present yourself as my wife to anyone who asks. At the end of the year, we dissolve the arrangement quietly and amicably. You return to your life. Why? I asked. My nephew Gerald is contesting my father's estate. The estate is still in probate. My father died 2 years ago at 91, and Gerald has filed a claim arguing I am not mentally fit to manage the inheritance. He is using my seclusion as evidence. If I can demonstrate that I am living a normal and connected life, his petition fails. The legal matter should resolve within the year. He paused. I need someone credible. You are a retired teacher with 30 years of community standing. You are a widow. You are not naive, based on the way you're looking at me right now, and you are, I suspect, desperate enough to hear me out. That's quite a list, I said. It's accurate. I should have been insulted. I wasn't, particularly. Because he was right on every point. I need to think, I told him. Of course. He reached into the breast pocket of his sweater and produced a business card, his lawyer's name and number, in Halifax. The contract is already drafted. You can have it reviewed by your own counsel. I would ask that you give me your answer by Monday evening. I drove back to Dartmouth with the radio off, watching the autumn trees go past in colors so sharp they almost hurt. That night, I sat with my daughter at the hospital while my grandson slept, and I watched the machine beside his bed track his breathing, and I made my decision. I called the lawyer on Sunday. The contract was thorough and fair. Every payment was guaranteed. There were protection clauses for both parties, confidentiality terms that were reasonable, an exit clause if either of us violated the agreement. I called the number on Edward's card Monday morning at 8 o'clock. I accept, I said. We married on a Tuesday in November in a room at the Halifax registry office with Ruth and Edward's lawyer as witnesses. I wore my navy wool dress. Edward wore a dark blazer and those gloves. The registrar read the words. We said yes. Edward did not kiss me. He nodded, once, the way a man confirms a meeting time, and we walked out into the gray Halifax afternoon as husband and wife. I moved into Ashford House that same day. Ruth showed me to a suite of rooms on the second floor, a bedroom, a small sitting room, a bathroom with a cast-iron tub and a view of the spruce trees and a slice of the ocean beyond. Everything was clean and impersonal and very quiet. He keeps to the study on the third floor most of the day, Ruth told me, smoothing the already smooth duvet. Breakfast is at 7:30 if you'd like to join him. He doesn't require conversation at breakfast. He prefers quiet. That's fine, I said. I spent 30 years teaching other people's children. I've earned the right to a quiet breakfast. Ruth looked at me for a moment, then smiled, the first real one I'd seen from her, and left. The treatment began that week. The clinic in Minneapolis confirmed receipt of the full payment the same afternoon as the wedding. Daniel's first appointment was scheduled for the following Monday. My daughter called me crying, and I sat on the edge of my new bed in someone else's house and cried too, and then I washed my face and went down to dinner. Dinner those first weeks was a precise and slightly absurd affair. Edward and I sat at opposite ends of a table built for 12 and exchanged information about upcoming obligations the way two people might compare calendars at a business meeting. There was a fundraising dinner for the Lunenburg Academy in 3 weeks, a reception at a law partner's home in Halifax the week after, a lunch with the Chester Municipality Council in December. You'll need to know the names of the major donors to the Academy, he said one evening, sliding a handwritten list across the table. The Graves family, the Olens, not the brewery Olens, their cousins, and Patricia Fenwick, who will tell you within 4 minutes that she attended school with Prince Charles. Let her. Despite myself, I laughed. He looked momentarily startled. Then something eased slightly around his eyes. The first social event was the Academy dinner, held in a restored heritage hall in Lunenburg. Edward collected me from my room, he knocked, which I appreciated, and we drove the 40 minutes mostly in silence. He helped me out of the car without being asked, and we walked in together with his arm formally offered, my hand resting on his sleeve. I could feel the leather of his glove through the fabric of my coat. People swarmed him. Or rather, they swarmed the idea of him. The mysterious Hartley had appeared in public, and with a wife, and the room shifted slightly on its axis. I smiled and shook hands and told people I was a retired teacher from Dartmouth, that Edward and I had reconnected through old family connections vague enough to be unverifiable, specific enough to sound true. Patricia Fenwick found me inside 7 minutes and mentioned Charles within 4. I nodded warmly and asked her about the Academy's arts program, which redirected her for 20 minutes. In the car home, Edward said, "You managed Patricia Fenwick in under 30 seconds. I taught junior high for 3 decades, I said. Patricia Fenwick is a 7-year-old with better shoes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Daniel's first Minneapolis results came back this afternoon. Dr. Osei emailed. Early indicators are favorable. I turned to look at him in the dark of the car. You're in contact with his doctor? I'm funding his care. I like to be informed. You could have told me when the email came. I'm telling you now. A pause. He said Daniel has been asking the nurses about structural engineering. Apparently, he saw some of the drawings in the hallway during a video call with you. I hadn't known Edward had noticed that. He wants to be an engineer, has since he was 9. Edward said nothing else for the rest of the drive. But the following week, a large format book on the history of Canadian bridge design appeared on the table in my sitting room with no note attached. I knew it wasn't Ruth. I began to notice things about the way Edward moved through his own house. He never stood with his back to a door. He handled objects, his coffee cup, his pen, the pages of a newspaper with both hands, carefully, as though managing something fragile. He wore the gloves always, indoors and out, even sitting alone in the library on evenings when he thought no one was around. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes heard him on the floor above me, not pacing exactly, but moving, as if stillness was something he had to earn. I asked Ruth once, on a morning in December when we were working together in the kitchen because the holidays felt less bleak with company, how long has he worn gloves? Ruth looked at the pot she was stirring. Since before I came to work here. 18 years. Do you know why? I know what I suspect, she said carefully. But it's not mine to tell. The trouble came in January. The way serious trouble usually does without warning and with its coat still on. I was in the main hallway arranging a delivery of firewood with the supplier when the front door opened and a man in an expensive overcoat came in without knocking. He was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of someone who has rarely been told no. You must be the teacher, he said, looking at me the way you'd look at furniture you didn't order. I'm Dorothy Hartley, I said, and you are in my house without an invitation. Gerald Hartley. He smiled without warmth. Edward's nephew. I've been wanting to meet the woman who convinced my uncle to get married after 70 years of being absolutely, pathologically alone. He looked around the hallway. Did he tell you about Millbank? I kept my expression neutral. You should wait for Edward. Millbank Tower. Toronto, 1999. He stepped closer. My uncle designed the parking structure. During construction, a section collapsed. 2 men died. He was investigated for criminal negligence. Cleared eventually, but it took 3 years, and by then his firm had dissolved and every client he had was gone. He tilted his head. Did he mention that? That he's been hiding up here ever since because he can't face what happened? That he hasn't touched a drafting table or a set of plans in 25 years? Get out of my house! Edward's voice came from the top of the staircase. I hadn't heard him come down. Gerald didn't flinch. Still wearing the gloves, I see. Does she know about the gloves, Eddie? Does she know why your hands shake? Gerald, you can barely hold a coffee cup. You think a judge is going to look at you and see a man capable of managing $40 million in estate assets? He looked at me again. This marriage is a performance, and I intend to prove that in court. I suggest you start thinking about what you'll do when it's over. Ruth appeared and showed him out with a quiet firmness that made me think she'd done this before. After Gerald left, the hallway was very still. I looked up at the staircase. Edward stood there with both hands gripping the banister, the gloves pale against the dark wood, and his face had gone the color of old plaster. He turned and went back upstairs without a word. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the big bed and listened to the Atlantic wind come off the water and thought about what Gerald had said. The shaking hands. 25 years of gloves. 2 men in a collapsed parking structure in Toronto. Around 1 a.m, I heard something from the floor above me, not a crash, but a sound like something dropped, and then silence that felt wrong somehow. I'd been a teacher long enough to know the difference between normal silence and the kind that means someone needs help. I went upstairs. His study door was open a few inches. I pushed it gently. He was sitting in the leather chair behind his desk, both gloves removed, his hands resting on the blotter in front of him. His eyes were open and fixed on nothing. The hands themselves were not physically scarred. They were the hands of a man in his 70s, strong-boned but fine, the hands of someone who'd once done precise and skilled work. But they were trembling. Not slightly. Continuously. Visibly. The way a compass needle trembles when it can't find north. He heard me and looked up, and for a moment he simply stared, too tired to be angry. "You don't have to pretend I'm not here," I said. "Please go back to bed, Dorothy." "I will. In a minute." I came in and sat in the small chair near the window. He didn't stop me. "Tell me about Millbank." A long silence. The wind moved through the spruce trees outside. "The structure was sound," he said finally, his voice flat and careful the way people speak when they've rehearsed something too many times. My calculations were correct. The collapse was caused by a subcontractor using non-compliant materials during a phase I wasn't on site to supervise. The investigation confirmed this. I was cleared. But I was the engineer of record. My name was on every drawing. I was responsible for oversight, and I trusted a man I shouldn't have trusted. His hands were still shaking, steady and terrible. Their names were Kevin Arsenault and Marco Pelletier. Kevin was 28. He had a daughter who was 3 months old. Marco was 51. He'd been in construction his whole life. He looked at his hands. The inquiry took 3 years. When it was done, I was technically innocent of everything, and I have not slept a full night since. I didn't say it wasn't his fault. I didn't say guilt is complicated, or that legal clearance means something. I'd been a teacher too long for easy comfort. "The tremors," I said, "started about 2 years after the collapse. The doctors call it essential tremor, exacerbated by chronic stress. It's not dangerous, it's just," he stopped. "I designed structures that were meant to hold the weight of the world, and I can't hold a pen without my hand shaking. So you wear gloves. So people don't see," he said. "So I don't have to explain. So I don't have to watch their faces change when they notice." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "When did you last see a specialist about the tremors?" "Years ago. There are treatments now. Medication. Therapeutic approaches. Deep brain stimulation in some cases. You haven't looked. I'm not interested in." "You funded a cutting-edge gene therapy trial in Minneapolis for a 16-year-old you'd never met," I said. "You're telling me you haven't spent 45 minutes looking into what might help your own hands." He stared at me. "You can be angry about that if you want," I said. "But I spent 30 years watching people choose suffering over help because they'd decided they didn't deserve the help, and it never once turned out to be the right call." I stood up. "I'm going to find you a specialist. You don't have to do anything yet, but I'm going to find one." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Daniel's results this week were better than the last. They're moving him to the second phase of the protocol early." It was such an Edward way of changing the subject. I accepted it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Good night." In February, he saw the neurologist in Halifax. I drove him there and sat in the waiting room and read a terrible magazine about celebrity gardens, and when he came out 45 minutes later he said nothing, but he had a prescription in his hand, and he let me drive home without protest. By March he was leaving the gloves off in the evenings when it was just the 2 of us. His hands still trembled, but with the medication, it was less enough that he could hold his coffee cup steadily, enough that he'd started doing crossword puzzles in ink again, which Ruth told me quietly he hadn't done in 15 years. He started coming to the library in the evenings. I'd be reading, and he'd take a book from the shelf and sit in the chair near the window, and we'd spend an hour or two in a companionable quiet that felt nothing like the professional silence of those first weeks. He'd started asking me things. About teaching, about my husband, about what I thought of various books. He had opinions about everything and delivered them with a precision that made me want to argue back, which I did, which seemed to please him in a way he tried not to show. He left a book on the history of Nova Scotia, one-room schoolhouses outside my door one morning without comment. I left a biography of Emily Carr outside his study the following week. We never acknowledged this exchange directly, which somehow made it more real. Daniel video called me every Sunday. His color was better. He was doing more. He'd started asking me questions about the drawings on the walls of Ashford House. And one Sunday I carried the tablet up to Edward's study, and he and my grandson talked for 45 minutes about cantilever design and the physics of suspension bridges. I sat in the corner and listened and thought about all the ways a year can be completely different from what you expected it to be. Gerald's legal action went to hearing in May. His lawyer was thorough and unpleasant. He presented evidence of Edward's years of seclusion, expert testimony about the psychological impact of the Millbank collapse, witness statements from people in the community who'd gone 20 years without seeing him in public. He argued that a man who'd hidden himself away for 2 decades, who exhibited clear anxiety symptoms, who'd worn gloves to hide a physical manifestation of psychological disturbance, could not be trusted to manage a significant estate. Then it was our turn. Ruth testified about the past 6 months, the social events, the dinners, the change in the house. The mayor of Chester testified about the Academy fundraiser, about how Edward had engaged thoughtfully with community members. Daniel's doctor in Minneapolis provided a written statement about the clear, rational, and well-informed nature of Edward's involvement in the treatment decisions. The neurologist testified that Edward's condition was being actively managed and posed no barrier to competent decision-making. Gerald's lawyer called me to the stand. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, with a tone that suggested the title was provisional. "You entered into this marriage under considerable financial pressure, correct?" "My grandson needed medical care," I said. "Yes. And Mr. Hartley paid for that care as part of a financial agreement. In other words, you were compensated to be here." I looked across the courtroom. Edward was sitting very still at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. No gloves, I noticed. He'd come to court without the gloves. I entered into an agreement with Edward. "Yes," I said. "But what we are now is not an agreement. It's a marriage. Can you prove that to this court?" I don't particularly think love requires proof in a courtroom, but I can tell you what I know. I turned slightly toward the judge. Edward Hartley has spent 25 years punishing himself for an industrial accident that a full legal inquiry determined was not his fault. He paid for my grandson's medical treatment before he had any guarantee I'd be a suitable companion at dinner parties. He sends Daniel books on structural engineering. He went to a neurologist for the first time in years because someone asked him to. He is the most honest person I have met since my husband died, and honesty is not something I've always found easy to come by. I looked at Gerald. His nephew wants control of this estate. That's the actual situation before this court. And if Gerald Hartley gains that control, $2 million in charitable trusts, including bursaries for Atlantic Canadian engineering students, gets liquidated for personal profit. I think that's worth knowing. The judge ruled in Edward's favor. Gerald's petition was dismissed. That evening, we sat on the veranda at Ashford House with mugs of tea, watching the fog move across the water in the way that maritime fog does, slowly and with great confidence. The legal matter was concluded. According to the contract, we had 4 weeks left before I was to file for divorce and return to Dartmouth. "I owe you considerably more than the contract stipulates," Edward said. "You owe me exactly what the contract stipulates," I said. I was very careful when I read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't want you to leave." I kept looking at the water. "I recognize that's not part of the arrangement," he said. "I recognize you have a life, a home, a family. I'm not asking you to give any of that up." A pause, and his voice was more careful than I'd ever heard it, careful the way someone is careful when they're saying something they cannot unsay. "But this year has been the first time in a very long time that this house has felt like something other than a place to be alone in. And that is because of you, specifically. You're arguing with me about novels. Your absolute refusal to pretend Patricia Fenwick isn't exhausting. The way you drove me to Halifax and didn't ask me one question about it afterward because you understood that sometimes people need help without commentary. That's a very architectural way to say, "You've enjoyed my company," I said. "I've enjoyed your company," he said directly. "And I love you. And I understand completely if—" Edward. "Yes. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at me. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he reached over, with his bare, trembling hands, and took mine. We renewed our vows in June on the Ashford House lawn, with Daniel there in his good shirt, stronger than he'd been in 3 years, and my daughter crying, and Ruth crying harder, and Edward's lawyer looking relieved in the way that lawyers look when things resolve without additional billing. Daniel starts engineering school in the fall. He's talking about structural work, infrastructure, bridges. He and Edward have been exchanging emails about it since April, and sometimes when I walk past the study I can hear them talking on the phone, my grandson and my husband, going back and forth about load-bearing principles and the way good design accounts for the things you can't predict. My daughter took a position at a school in Chester so she could be closer. She has dinner with us most Sundays, which keeps things lively. Ruth, when I told her she no longer needed to call me Mrs. Hartley and could call me Dorothy, said she would think about it. It's been 4 months. She's still thinking about it. I respect that. Edward still wears gloves to formal events. He doesn't wear them around the house anymore. His hands still shake, and probably always will to some degree, and he has learned to let them. He volunteers 2 Saturdays a month at Dalhousie's engineering faculty, talking to students about design ethics and the weight of responsibility and the difference between a legal outcome and a moral one. He doesn't design buildings anymore, but he teaches the people who will, which he told me once, quietly, is more than he ever thought he'd deserve. I am 64 years old, remarried, living in a stone house on the Atlantic Ocean with a man who leaves books outside my door and argues with me about Canadian literature and holds my hand with hands that are not steady but are always, always there. I married a man to save my family and discovered he had spent 25 years waiting for someone to tell him he was worth saving too. Sometimes the best things in your life start as a transaction. Sometimes they become the truest thing you have. We chose each other on a Tuesday in November, in a government office, with no flowers and no fuss, and we keep choosing it every single day. That part, I did not see coming. That part is the best part of the whole story.